Hi there, I'm Tom Field. I'm Senior Vice President of Editorial with Information Security Media Group. I want to welcome you to this very special panel discussion today. I entitled this Cybersecurity's Inconvenient Truth, if I can borrow from the former Vice President. But instead of talking about the environment, I'm talking about the nation-state threat. Really pleased to welcome here. We've got Sam Curry, CSO with Cybereason, Tom Kellermann, Head of Cybersecurity Strategy with VMware Carbon Black, and my colleague Steve King. He's Director of Cybersecurity Advisory Services with CyberTheory. Gentlemen, thanks so much for joining me here today. So I want to start off with something of a provocative question. And it occurs to me that if we were to see Chinese or Russian or Iranian planes, submarines, troops suddenly offshore, the U.S. would be up at arms, literally. My question for you is, why isn't there similar outrage about foreign cyber intrusions?
Back in the Obama administration, after some of the really big breaches, President Obama actually said that cyber is a casus belli. It is a cause for war. Later, it was rapidly amended by the State Department and the president then to say that the appropriate response to cyber is cyber. And so that was the tone up until that. But then much later, the IDF actually responded to cyber with a rocket attack with Hamas and put it on Twitter. So clearly we crossed some kind of phase. The problem, I think, to answer your question really directly, is it's easy to point to a dead archduke, for the First World War. It's easy to point to a smoking hole in the ground or a sunk ship. It's really hard with the general anonymity of the internet frontier to say, you did me wrong and lives suffered, or there's a measurable material loss that is adequate for a casus belli.
I think what's missing is our appreciation for the fact that that axis of evil that you've delineated has waged an insurgency in American cyberspace for a protracted period of time now. And they've masqueraded as trusted infrastructure due to the nature in which they enjoy the construct of island hopping. This is compounded with the fact that we need to respond in a proportional fashion. And these countries have actually insulated themselves far better in almost a balkanized way to robust cyber attacks against their infrastructure. Last point, unique to the environment, almost like what we saw in South America in the 70s, there's a pax mafiosa between the most prolific cyber crews, criminal elements, and the government to maintain untouchable status. And in exchange, they act as cyber militia members.
It's an existential threat, but it doesn't evoke a visceral response, right? I mean, you see it, you can believe that it's going on, but there's no evidence of it. If you look at the other existential threat that we have made much of in the last few years, global warming, there's evidence, right? You can see icebergs melting, you can see oceans rising, you can see California, Oregon, and Washington catch on fire. And all of that sort of evidence makes it easier to have a visceral reaction to, and you can wrap your head around it.
We talk a lot about election interference. That's the headline that gets people's attention, but we all know that's just one very narrow view of nation-state cyber activity. Tom, I'd love for you to take this first and then hear from Sam and Steve as well. How do you describe the true nation-state threat to the U.S., and how does it manifest today beyond election security?
As we can see, according to the World Economic Forum, the dark web economy of scale will be larger than the state of California's economy by next year, which is in the trillions of dollars, making it the third largest economy in the world. The majority of the proceeds associated with the pillaging of Americans has been pumped into the anonymous payment channels of Eastern Europe and have actually facilitated and offsetting economic sanctions to rogue nation states. And this has become so pervasive that you see this fundamental restructuring of cyber crime cartels, where there's a lot of collaboration that is occurring between criminal groups, nation state groups, and other criminal groups, as evidenced just recently by the Maze cartel working with Ragnar Locker on various campaigns to modernize ransomware and make it more elusive. But to this point, number one, we've seen such capital flight out of the American economy, both from an intellectual property standpoint, but also from a financial standpoint due to cybercrime over the years. It's dramatic. Secondarily, They have backdoored and burrowed into so much of our critical infrastructure community that it's really a question of when they have the resolve to become destructive. According to VMware Carbon Black's data, we're seeing over 102% increase of destructive attacks. Now, many times that's part of counter-incident response, but a lot of times it has a geopolitical vein to it. My greatest concern now is the arms bazaars of the dark web will endow asymmetrical capability to non-state actor groups that have the resolve to leverage a kinetic impact. And that'll probably happen soon.
I would say that what happens on the light side of the economy happens on the dark side is the first thing. So just as it's getting harder and harder to tell where the digital economy and the physical one, if that even means anything anymore, where the seam is, it's becoming much more blurred. We would have had more economic impact if we weren't largely a digital economy, right? So the terrible numbers we see at the macro economy would be worse if this had hit us, say, 10 years ago or 20 years ago. And so the same thing is true on the dark side. And actually, you can tell the age and the size approximately of an ecosystem by how diverse it is. You can do this in economics, you can do this in nature, you can do this in linguistics. And what we see is high degrees of specialization. And what Tom just alluded to was super important. And what he called out is that there is honor among thieves, that there is barter and there is trade, and that there's optionality for nation states if their tools get picked up by hacktivists and by cyber criminals, and vice versa, and that there's talent shared and techniques developed. That this is a rich ecosystem, and to recognize, I love that you called it out as an economy and its size, because we need to think about it like that, and it will continue to thrive and grow even when the rest of us suffer and slow down.
I think, Tom, you alluded to the issue of influence cyber ops as well, right? Where our adversaries are putting people and processes in place where they're identifying friction points and then driving information to fuel both sides of that equation. And the Chinese and the Russians are quite good at it. So the best way to execute their 100-year plan in China is to simply take over the West, and the best way to do that is to initially just divide the culture.
I think of it in two ways. It's an extension of every other form of conflict that we've ever known, and it's its own domain in its own right.
China, Russia, Iran. We could add North Korea and others to the list. I'd love to ask this question of each of you. And Sam, maybe you can kick us off. How do you rank the adversaries by degree of threat posed to the U.S. now?
Most nation states' own intelligence services estimate these, and they rank them in terms of capability, ability and reach and sophistication. But we also need to not think of nations as monolithic. Hey, China is the enemy, or Russia is the enemy. China has over 50 agencies that have a hacking capability, offensive, and use it. Russia has over 70. And by the way, this is not just a nation state game. There's also hacktivism, non-state actors, which is a euphemism for organizations like Al-Qaeda or ISIS, to name two. But others, also the right wing, and then the organized, the Pax Mafioso. I love that phrase. I'm gonna steal it for sure.
First and foremost, it's all about motivation, resolve, and most importantly, strategic goals. It's not in China's best interest to destroy American infrastructure in cyberspace or to leverage destructive attacks. And frankly, destructive attacks are what are keeping me up at night and the most concerning to me. It is, according to the Gerasimov doctrine, it is in Russia's best interest to destabilize the West. And should they have to take the gloves off, they've already burrowed into so much of our infrastructure that they could render it non-resilient. They could actually affect, through integrity attacks, kinetic manifestations. I'm incredibly concerned about what will happen with the Russian-speaking dark web that is beholden for their untouchable status to the Kremlin, what will happen on November 4th and 5th. I am. And this is compounded by the fact that it's all about improving the optics of the legacy of the hegemony of the Soviet Union, and payback is part of that whole stratagem. This is finally, and I must add this, the level of technology transfer and bona fides that have been provided to Iran and North Korea by the same country that has given them the design specs for missiles, for weaponry, etc., is to a point where now they have essentially proxies, and essentially they can unleash the hounds. So I'm incredibly concerned about this fall and this winter. The Chinese threat is significant when it comes to intellectual property theft. It's significant when it comes to the level of omniscience that they may have in organizations. But it's that nexus between criminality, rogue nation states, and a regime who actually flourishes because of them, which I'm most concerned about.
The intellectual property issue with China has moved also beyond that to get out in front of it. So the easiest way to get your hands on a startup or early stage company's IP is to take a large venture position. And we see venture capital firms emerging throughout China, throughout Sand Hill Road, that are taking secondary and tertiary positions behind companies like Sequoia Capital, but they're also making large investments. So the way the venture model works, if your LPs have taken a large position in you, and you've taken a large position in that company you've invested in, you have access. You're allowed access to all of that IP. So they're getting the IP well before it's even out into the marketplace.
Each one of you has got hands-on experience with some of the threats and the threat actors we've talked about here. What can you share that you've seen personally? I'd love to hear from you, Stephen, from Thomas, Sam as well.
One of the biggest problems that we encountered when we had a large MSSP, MDR company, and we opened offices in Beijing and Shanghai. We had a SOC in Hong Kong, and we tried to convince the Chinese Ministry of Defense that the SOC was okay. They insisted on getting access to all of our IP, every sales plan, every sales pitch deck, every business plan, every partnership agreement that we had. That's an example. I don't think a lot of people really understand or appreciate it. It's one of the things that bothers me a lot, is that we talk about China in many cases as if they were a competitor versus a true adversary. And it's been, after 6 years in China, it's very clear to me that the latter is in fact true.
But I have been involved in 3 failed attempts to defend against nation states. Most people, I don't think, offer that pretty readily. 2 of them were China, and one of them was Iran. Perhaps the one almost 10 years ago now, we in fact faced 2 Chinese adversaries, 2 different agencies, and one had hacked the other one, amazingly. So agency 1 came in and had one set of data, and agency 2 came in and had hacked them to get entrance. And I suspect it had to do with them, not just in turn-assigned warfare, but they were opportunistic. They were looking to get to the U.S. government, and they saw us as a stepping stone there. Incredibly painful, and certainly, actually, my very first experience way back, having fought them and won many times, was with Russia in the late '90s, electronic warfare and cyber warfare, and the old honey trap, the old flattery. It's meet you at a trade show and then ask questions, and then it hit you on all fronts. It wasn't just cyber then, and it isn't just cyber now. But what I've seen from Iran most recently is DDoS attacks for hire, seeding cybersecurity community with tools for which they have backdoors that provides them options. And we saw that with Operation Ababil, for instance, where they went after Wall Street, but they did it as a hire from another nation, right? So Russia gets mad at the US, it goes to Iran, which is exactly as Tom said. It's a proxy and it's capable, even if they're not ideologically aligned, they certainly share resources and align against a common enemy. And that then Iran then takes over the cyber criminal toolkits they've put out there for them to use, and boom, you get 60 gig per second against every bank overnight and climbing. And frankly, they've got turbocharging now. You throw in things like social media, and you throw in all the potential for communication. None of us, I think, expected, in a world where we could all know almost anything with computers that we carry around with us all the time, that this would be divisive to society, and it didn't have to go this way, and it doesn't have to continue to go this way.
I think there's just been a dramatic escalation You're seeing adversaries become more punitive. They have a cult of personality. They know they're untouchable. You see a dramatic increase. 82% of investigations that use our capabilities are seeing counter incident response, where they're playing with timestamps and deleting logs and disabling AMSI, and even going so far as dropping wipers in system or ransomware NotPetya style to punish the defender. That is exacerbated by the phenomenon that 55% of the time they're island hopping. Even the Secret Service had to put out a warning to all the banks 3 months ago, stating that the managed service providers for the financial sector of the United States were being targeted so that they could island hop into those banks themselves. And they have much more knowledge of the interdependencies that exist within industries. For example, if you hack this thing and get to the other, but more importantly, they're not going to stop there. I think the game changer here is the fact that they're willing to commandeer your digital transformation to attack your constituency. And it's a matter of time before they do that and then leverage destructive attacks from that island. And that's what's really concerning to me now. And I think geopolitical tension will be the harbinger of that phenomenon.
I'd like to get your view on what you think is actually going to happen with this election now that we've got, 3 weeks left, I guess.
Look, the disinformation campaigns will abound. They will increase by targeting social media and actually targeting journalists themselves in their social media accounts, as well as the websites of secretaries of state. I am concerned about ransomware interfering with the productivity and operations of state systems being deployed NotPetya style, obviously. But because of the voter turnout and because of the number of states that allow for mail-in ballots, I feel that given those two phenomenon and given the fact that China, Russia, and Iran have varying agendas vis-a-vis who they want to win, I think that through that fog of war, we actually will have integrity in our election. I am heartened by the efforts of CISA, FBI, NSA, DHS, even Microsoft stepping in and helping out recently with very unique lawsuits or copyright trademark law applications to dismantle a huge botnet called TrickBot. But look, we should be very concerned. I'm hoping that 4 years from now, that greater investment is given into the state's infrastructures to secure themselves from a very viable threat to undermine democracy. But again, I'll reiterate, I think because of the competing agendas, mail-in voting, high turnouts, I think we're going to be okay.
I would first give advice to consumers and to citizens and say, believe nothing that you hear in those last days. Double check your sources. Remember your civics courses from when you were young about understanding. Don't just go to one or two sources. Go broad as you decide to vote, because it's super important, and be leery of things that seem to happen in the last few days.
John, before we started recording here, we talked a little bit about the evolution of this nation-state threat just over the past 3 years. Tom, get us started here. How have you seen the adversaries, as well as their tactics, their techniques, their procedures, evolve to what we've described today?
So the operational security of nation states has dramatically improved. Rogue nation states like North Korea and Iran have directly benefited from tech transfer from Russia that has empowered them with advanced capabilities, more than they had 2 years ago, for sure. You see, again, the embrace of the island hopping phenomenon to jump through connected ecosystems and industries. There's been obviously a dramatic increase or escalation of punitive attacks and counter incident response and destroying infrastructure on the way out, maybe just to burn the evidence, maybe to punish the victim in general because of political ideology. But most importantly, I think there's a robust arms bazaar that is in Eastern Europe that is providing advanced capabilities to neophytes to allow them to get in the game. This is coupled with a new service offering where you can buy access to a specific entity that's already been taken over or compromised by a cyber attack, access mining. There are various forums dedicated to this. So even if you're a non-sophisticate in cyber attack or cyber defense, you could purchase access to company X, and then you could purchase ransomware capabilities over here, and you could just use that access to deploy said capability and create a monetization event. Or you could just leverage it for destructive purpose. And that's very concerning to me. It's very concerning now that you can buy access to a specific system, and then you can buy a capability that could render that system and render it inadequate, render it essentially like a piece of stone because you choose to, for whether it's financial gain or ideological belief. And these lords of war need to be held to account. I think it's a great reason why the cyber fraud task forces of the Secret Service are expanding into other countries, and why their sole focus of the cyber fraud task forces of the Secret Service now are disrupting the dark web.
I think at the end of last year, I would have pointed to the proliferation of fileless malware living off the land. And I would say that not only have they gotten more sophisticated, but they also fight back. There was a time when we likened this to submarine warfare, right? If the attackers suddenly believed the defenders were on them, they went silent and they waited for their beacons and their back doors and for an opportunity to come back. And they'll fight it tooth and nail for a system now. And I think we'd be remiss if we didn't say that there's almost two motions here. Building on what Tom said, the first is, it's like, imagine if you lived in a city where gangs were getting more bold and vicious. That's ransomware. I used to say it's retrograde, but I'm going to go further and say you have to worry for your physical safety in that analogy. But at the same time, the more sophisticated criminals are taking over city government. They're stealing billions from the banks, and they're basically trying to own society to a certain degree, in my analogy. And both motions are happening. That latter motion is the nation state. And it helps when there's havoc on the streets. I think we're going to go through misinformation, disinformation, and some saber rattling, and maybe some pretty serious things happening around the election. And then next year, we're going to see, as we go from when, work at the office, work at home, now work from anywhere, we're going to start to see new attacks turn up against things like home automation, targeting things like ISP spaces, because that's the new enterprise footprint, going after IoT and OT devices, even dusting off old BIOS attacks and printers and routers. So the time for them to start putting away the old tools is right around October, November. I think ransomware will continue to go after those who must pay. I mean, heck, we've seen them go after healthcare, and it's disgusting, right? We've seen them go after critical infrastructure, also disgusting. But what we're going to see is new attacks and more subtle ones that use new playbooks.
I'd be curious from your perspective, as well as Tom's and Steve's, what are you seeing in terms of counter incident response when we do go on the defensive?
Counter hacking, right? Which inevitably happens, by the way, in a second order chaos system, right? When we used to talk about, counter missiles and counter missiles and counter missiles, same thing in intelligence. To some degree, that's there. But most of us don't have security departments on the private sector side that can scale like that, nor should we, probably. There are other ways of becoming more efficient, but that is definitely what's happening in governments. We already have counter intel and counter intel. And that is exactly what I would expect to see the evolution to be, as in other domains of human conflict. So yeah, that's the pattern, and that's what we followed here.
Okay, let's talk about active defense. It's a spectrum, first of all, so we need to appreciate it's a spectrum of activity. I'm a purist in that I believe that only law enforcement or the government agencies should be allowed to actually conduct that type of activity, and they should do so in a much more robust fashion, frankly. When it comes to private corporations, only when the government issues letters of marque to the cybersecurity industry will that be permissible. But in the interim, I think there is room for discussion about whether or not, well, can I put a beacon, and this isn't happening now, but could I put a beacon in a data set or in a workload so that when it is compromised, I know where it went? Or could I destroy my own data or own workload, just when it leaves my environment, much like you could, brick a phone when it's stolen by like a traditional criminal? Or could I really provide greater telemetry around the infrastructure of the adversary that took said thing? I think really the space we're in right now is that the use of deception technology and as well as the use of greater telemetry capabilities, much like Cybereasons, much like VMware Carbon Blacks, that give you enough telemetry so someone who has the authority to act can act. And that's why cyber threat hunting is so important. And for those who are not familiar with our space, cyber threat hunting is not incident response. It's a different animal. You're looking for behavioral anomalies within your own infrastructure or ecosystem they're real. They're not false positive. And in addition to that, you never got an alarm that signaled there was some sort of strange behavior occurring in your house. But after you turned on the alarm and you locked the doors, and before you went to bed, you checked every room to make sure no one was in it. That is really what it is. And I think that is of paramount importance given what we've described here today.
I think we as an industry could do a lot more innovation in terms of getting ahead of the bad guys and the attackers. And there's many more options we can pursue to make their life hard without disrupting business or with minimal impact.
Aren't there major companies that we all know and love operating offensive security protocols right now and sort of under the covers or not talking about that?
You're quite right, but they're in a gray area of the law. Some of them are large enough that they can even work with the government or governments around some of these things. I don't believe, though, that we should be giving out, open hunting licenses to companies and endorsing that. It becomes a much more multipolar world, less predictable, and frankly, companies aren't created, general companies, not special purpose companies, with the aim to become cyber militiamen and warfare fighters, right? We don't do this in any other domain, and the potential to make mistakes and hurt the innocent is enormous. So it is happening to some degree. It's not that widespread. My advice is, guys, we should find a better collective stance rather than, and we should use government carefully and perhaps a uniquely American or whatever other democracy way, rather than take the law into our own hands and turn into vigilantes.
So which government agency is going to take this on?
That's partly a political decision, and there isn't a path that says here's the right way to do it. I think it takes time to get it right, and it's about debate. It's about being open where we stand. It's about putting ideas out not to be right, but so they can be critiqued. That's the nature of democracy. So the answer isn't, Steve, I hate to say it, hand it to NSA or hand it to CISA. It is instead, we have to evolve this. And like other policy issues, there's no, we may look back and go, well, that was obvious. But looking forward, it's not so obvious.
Well, I'd like to applaud the efforts, the interagency efforts of NSA and CISA and FBI and Secret Service. Recently, there's been, it's unprecedented collaboration between those groups to really dismantle and go after some of these cyber militias, cyber criminals, cyber spies. That being said, for decades, we were basically getting assaulted with both hands tied behind our backs, which is why we're dealing with an insurgency in American cyberspace. But I think right now we got one hand out.
But I think it's also going to take whoever is either reelected or elected anew in November, and however that plays out, a national cyber strategy is a must. This is not trivial, and I think the next administration will have a huge role to play here.
Tom, I'm going to come back to you for a second because you've repeatedly told me over the years that it's time to take off the gloves. I want to ask you what that would look like if we get both gloves off and both hands up.
It's time for the United States government, the Five Eyes, and NATO to take off the gloves as it relates to the insurgency that currently is flourishing within our digital environments. What that looks like, I think it begins with disinformation campaigns against the dark web, specific to these actors that are cyber militia members, to either make them look like they are complicit in cooperation with foreign law enforcement, or that they are conducting shady activities, or basically they are rippers. You got to undermine the trust in that environment. Second, we really have to go after the exchanges that are allowing for the transfer of funds and capital for goods and services in that dark web, which again will force the dark web to turn on itself when people aren't being paid for delivery of capabilities or assets. So through a disinformation campaign, we need to actually destabilize the dark web and create an insurgency within the trust of the dark web. But more importantly, I think it's time that the ISP community, as just recently illustrated, must get together to sinkhole dark web forums, to sinkhole command and control associated with known colonization campaigns. Beyond that, whatever you want to put your mind to, but frankly, I think that it's time that specific assets that are controlled by government agencies that have been targeting us that those be crippled by a cyber attack. And I don't mean denial of service, and I don't mean ransomware, but something more unique than that. Force them to replace that infrastructure and do it over a national holiday, which really pisses them off the most.
We're the United States. We're one of the biggest and best fortified nations in the world. Why can't we? Why don't we just go out and lead a cyber desert storm?
There's a multiplicity of actors. It's a free fire zone. There's so many proxies and cyber militia members and folks that are working on behalf of the government to maintain untouchable status. That's the challenge. Plus, they've compromised so much of our infrastructure that we would be literally blowing up our own stuff. So I'm at a loss to answer that.
What was it Secretary Clinton said? It's hard to punch your banker in the mouth. I'm paraphrasing. But then again, politics of Desert Storm notwithstanding, where's the desert you send the troops to? This isn't just a cyber conflict, right? This is a game of nations that's played out over generations and decades and centuries. Right, that Chinese 100-year plan. And if you think about it, the folks who are behind, whether it's the Soviet Union or the oligarchs who succeeded them and president for life, the people that are actually conducting warfare against the West generally and on a global scale, this is another tool. It's not just a cyber conflict.
I think it's a desert storm in reverse. Tom, is the best we should focus on. Why don't we figure out how to defend ourselves? Why? And it requires a national initiative. It requires leadership. We don't have either of those things today. It's not politically popular. No one, again, it's not a visceral threat, so no one cares enough about it.
Tom, beyond the 2020 election, which we've covered pretty well here, what are your biggest concerns about the nation-state threat actors and what they can do to disrupt our nation through deep fakes, critical infrastructure strikes? You see more than any of us do.
It depends on geopolitical tension, frankly. You've got one adversary that is very active, but is very cognizant that we're their number one debtor and their number one consumer. So it's not in their best interest to leverage destructive attacks or integrity attacks against critical infrastructures. Unless tensions boil over, obviously, in the South China Sea. You have another adversary that's all about proud activity, robust manifestation historically, and revenge, frankly, for the disrespect that was shown to them during Glasnost. And that adversary, I'm very concerned about the asymmetrical modular attack capabilities that are being distributed by that adversary to non-state actor groups and criminal groups around the world that is fostering this fog of war, as well as the day they decide they've given up on relations with the West. And obviously we will see a pulse of that in Eastern Europe in the coming months. But when they've decided they've given up and basically the hounds are unleashed and the access to sensitive critical infrastructures is leveraged to deploy destructive malware. There is the Silicon Valley of the East, and it's in St. Petersburg. And we need to recognize that and appreciate it, because the driving force behind entrepreneurial Americans who get into IT is, wealth and the desire to create an application or just create some new widget that could be acquired. The driving force in the East is the capacity to be omniscient and telepathic and make so much money and become a Robin Hood. And it's that cultural distinction that we need to pay attention to here. And I think it's just really a matter of time. In the 22 years I've been looking at this, winter is coming. It has come. We just don't feel it yet.
What message do you have for our executive, our legislative, and our military leaders about response to the nation-state threat?
To the executive branch, I think right now you have the ability to task agencies and to make sure that security is a priority. And I think going into the next administration, the executive needs to make this what executive orders are used, what happens in the first 90 days, where does security fit in the policy hierarchy? Super important to the military, but I would say to the defense establishment as a whole and to law enforcement, be aware of the cyber dimension with whatever comes your way. right? It might not seem to be cyber related, or it might not seem to have a cyber dimension. Make sure that you're prepared to call on the cyber resources and to bring them to bear when called upon. And as for legislative, I think once we have another session of Congress starting in the new year, once we get the Senate and we know how it all shakes down, I think hopefully it's a time for bipartisanship. Hopefully it's a time to put cyber on the agenda, and constructive laws that involve the cyber community. Ask us. You will do a lot of harm if you just try to, apply laws that you used for RICO or for drug wars to this without engaging the cyber community in a dialogue. Right? The Cyberspace Solarium report had some great ideas in it, and I think that once the urgency of COVID either subsides or other issues emerge into the light, we're going to dust that off and go find some interesting things.
So, cybersecurity is a patriotic imperative. Stop looking at this like a partisan issue. It's driving me crazy. It's driving all of us crazy. And you're creating an opportunity, a window for our adversaries to undermine our culture, our economy, and our national security. Second, the Solarium report, the Cyberspace Solarium report, is quintessentially important to enact. It has some of the best recommendations I've seen in years that should be promulgated into regulation, legislation, and government funding. Third, draw a red line in the sand with our adversaries. It's similar to what we do with terrorism. If you're going to aid and abet a terrorist inside our sovereign country, then you're going to deal with a consequence and create a shared risk methodology. And then lastly, and most importantly, my God, there are trillions of dollars that have been stolen from us that are being leveraged in the economy of scale of the dark web. It's high time that we created a super fund domestically and modernized forfeiture laws and regulations and modernize anti-money laundering laws and regulations so that we can bring that money home to fund critical infrastructure protection domestically, please.
We talked about your message to the government, to the military. What is your message to the civilian cybersecurity leaders, the business cybersecurity leaders who are defending much of our critical infrastructure asset?
My advice is minimal change with your IT staff, right? Just as you would if you were a retail industry during Black Friday and the run up to the holidays. Try to keep things simple. Try to spot and I think it's also to business leaders. If you're contemplating, to what degree do we go back to the office, what have you, think carefully about what you actually need to change between now and, let's say, a week after the election. And just gear up, right? Have everybody on call the weekend before, and make sure that you know what it is you have to protect and who you're going to call.
I think our business cybersecurity leaders are completely overwhelmed, understaffed, underskilled, and don't have the wherewithal to do the job that has expanded and exploded in front of them. That's just my take. We need to do so many things in education and in upskilling, and so quickly, and in resource allocation and staffing and CapEx and OpEx support. And the constant cycle of we can't get the board to do X, we can't communicate with our board doesn't understand, yada yada yada. It's tiresome, right? We've been having the same conversation for years and years and years, and as long as we continue to do the same thing that we did before and expect a different result, obviously that's crazy. So that's what I think is at the core of this dilemma that we have right now.
Look, cybersecurity is a functionality of conducting business. It's not an expense anymore. And this message goes directly to the CEOs and boards of directors that are listening to this or watching this. Pay attention. The survivability of your organization, the brand of your organization is based on the success of that chief information security officer. Elevate that defensive coordinator to be equal to the offensive coordinator, that is the CIO. They should have separate budgets. They should have separate authorities, and they should be able to veto any initiative by the CIO that could increase the attack surface. Worst case scenario has changed. Your infrastructure will be taken over and used to attack your customers. The lawsuits that will result from that, seriously, are coming as the regulatory fines are coming, and you won't be able to return from that because your brand will be damaged forever. And when it comes to actually the CISOs out there, Well, you don't know what you don't know. So conduct more cyber threat hunting in general. Integrate your security controls. Believe in things like just-in-time administration, and really extend this to your information supply chain. It's fundamental that you practice premises of microsegmentation across that, given the transitory nature of attacks and island hopping as a whole.
We have an unfortunate habit in this nation to simplify our problems, to politicize them. We see that with COVID-19. Who would ever think that putting on a mask would be a political issue? And we have a tendency to be distracted too easily. This concerns me as we as a nation try to step up to tackle this nation state threat, because I have the fear that whether it's our political leaders, our military leaders, our community leaders, we're going to oversimplify it, we're going to politicize it, we're going to get distracted, and all of that is to the benefit of the adversaries that want to disrupt what we're doing. Sam, Steve, Tom, I want to thank you so much for your insights. It's been a terrific discussion. Clearly, we haven't resolved anything, but at least we've got some strong messages that we can share and deliver. So thank you for your time today. For Information Security Media Group, I'm Tom Field. Thank you so much for giving us your time and your attention today.